Hey folks, welcome to the Digital Debate Center. This is the last video that we're going to do in a series of videos about the Mexico Affirmative, which is the new affirmative and evidence packet that has been released by the Atlanta Urban Debate League. Today we're going to focus on, since we've already focused on what the affirmative is, what the negative strategies are, we're going to focus on the case debate. That is to say, the negative responses to the affirmative's case and what the 2AC has to answer those arguments. There's a lot of nuance going on in regards to different sources of weapons, different pieces of evidence, different points of data. So I want to make sure we go over those in detail. So let's review what is the affirmative case. So the affirmative case, the plan, reduces foreign military sales and direct commercial sales to the United Mexican States, which we commonly refer to as Mexico. So there are two advantages. The first is the war crimes advantage, to spark folks' memory. We have a piece of Epstein evidence that says that the Mexican authorities are committing war crimes with US-made weapons. And independent of that, because the Mexican military and Mexican police are the largest suppliers of guns to Mexican citizens, they're responsible for the more than 30,000 gun deaths that happen every year in Mexico. So we have our first advantage is the war crimes advantage. Mexican military and police are committing war crimes. Independently, the Mexican homicide rate is driven by US-made guns. The second advantage says that Mexico is on the verge of collapse, and unless we de-escalate the war with the cartels, Mexico will become a failed state. So now that we know a bit about what the affirmative plan is, what the advantages are, let's go over the negative responses to these contention. So we have two arguments against the war crimes advantage. The first is the Osman piece of evidence, which responds to the claim that the Mexican police are committing war crimes with US-made weapons. Now that's kind of a point of fact that that's happening. The question is, does the affirmative solve that by taking away access to military-style weapons? The answer is no, according to Osman, because this piece of evidence says that the incentives for corruption are so high that for over a decade, the Mexican government has been promising new reform initiatives, new policies and procedures, and none of them have helped because none of them eliminate the financial incentives for Mexican elites to co-opt the Mexican police. The Mexican police is incredibly underfunded. They have to buy their own bullets. They have to buy their own uniforms. They get paid like $500 a month. They're not paid that well, which means that corruption is inevitable. As to whether or not the counterclaim can solve that, that's a question for a different day. So in other words, the Mexican police are going to continue to make human rights violations so long as there's a financial incentive for them to do so, and whether they commit it with a minigun or with a shotgun or a semi-automatic rifle, that's up to them. So the affirmative cannot solve their war crimes impact. The second piece of evidence is this Linthicum evidence, which says that the vast majority of guns that the cartels use do not come from the Mexican military and Mexican police. Instead, cross-border smuggling due to lax US gun laws is the root cause of how the cartels get their hands on weapons, which means that the homicide rate, which the 1AC Epstein evidence claims is driven by weapons exports, is actually driven by cross-border smuggling. In particular, this piece of evidence cites ATF figures that show that 70% of guns that are seized at cartel crime scenes and traced come from the United States. So we have hard data that says that 70% of the guns that the cartels use are from US gun stores that are bought by US citizens and smuggled across the border. So what does the 2AC have to say in response? This Osman evidence, really, we're just going to extend our Epstein evidence. Remember, extension is when you use the evidence you've already read in order to answer an argument made by your opponent. So I might say, extend the 1AC Epstein evidence, which says that the US supplies weapons to the Mexican police and Mexican military, which are then used to commit war crimes. They say that corruption is inevitable. Sure, there's some level of corruption that's probably inevitable. But the question is, does the Mexican military have the capacity to use US-made miniguns to slaughter en masse civilians? The answer is no, because we're not selling them to them anymore. So let's look at the answer to this gun smuggling argument for all you negative folks out there. This is a really good argument because it's backed up by data. The Blanchfield evidence says that since 2014, this is going to be run in the 2AC, the Mexican military has had massive amounts of foreign military sales, and data shows that the Mexican police have lost 3.5 firearms every day, most police departments. That means that out of that $2.16 million worth of weapons in 2014, a large majority of it, a large amount, went to the cartels, which means that the U.S. sales are the single biggest supplier of weapons to the cartels and weapons to Mexico generally. So gun violence, generally speaking, is caused by U.S. military exports. So let's talk about the collapse debate. Here we have to put on our thinking caps a little bit. So the first two arguments that we're going to make on the negative against the collapse advantage will seem to contradict the arguments we made on the war crimes advantage. So remember, on the war crimes page, we said cross-border smuggling is responsible for the vast majority of guns in Mexico. However, on the collapse debate, we're going to say that the vast majority of weapons, military-style weapons that the cartels acquire, are acquired from other Latin American countries and other countries which are suppliers. The reason this does not contradict is because we're talking about different types of violence. In general, gun crime in Mexico, people just having access to weapons because of strict Mexican laws on ownership, come from the United States. That's our linthicum evidence. However, the cartels, the military style weapons that they're acquiring, the vast majority of them are from other countries' militaries and other countries' production facilities. So where do the cartels get their military style weapons, their grenades, their tanks? Other countries. Where do the vast majority of Mexican citizens who get weapons acquire weapons? Small scale semi-automatic handguns and rifles. They acquire them from guns that are smuggled across the border. So we have two pieces of evidence here. The first is a piece of law evidence that says that due to the history of counterinsurgency activity and military buildup in Latin America, there's just a ton of weapons sitting around in Latin America that can then be smuggled up to Mexico. So a prime example of this is Colombia, where the US government funded counterinsurgency efforts against the FARC. The FARC is gone. What do those weapons do? They get resold to people who are willing to pay top dollar for them. So that's what Lott says. The Stratford piece of evidence says that in particular, places like Guatemala, Colombia, etc., are the ones that are selling military-style weapons to the Mexican drug cartels. So as opposed to the affirmative, which says, hey, we're going to de-escalate by taking away access to weapons, to military-style weapons, so the violence doesn't get out of hand, because there's a big difference between tanks rolling down the streets of Mexico and people with semi-automatic rifles rolling down the streets. Instead, the negative says, hey, the cartels are going to buy those anyway from other countries. Now, the impact, remember, to collapse is that Mexico becomes a failed state, the government ceases to function. We have two pieces of evidence that respond to this. The first is the Mazzaro evidence, which says that historically, following the Cold War, people were really concerned about Soviet satellite states declining and collapsing. However, the impacts of WMD proliferation, massive conflicts, have yet to materialize, which means that empirically the impact is not true. And then the Durso piece of evidence says that there's a financial incentive for people to publish articles about failed states because of media bias, and they want to get clicks on their website, etc. So what does the 2AC have to say in response? The 2AC reads a piece of Mugga and Thompson evidence that says that the US has exported more than $300 million worth of weapons in the last decade to Mexico, and is the single largest supplier of weapons to Mexico. That means that arms exports are the key internal link as to how cartels get their weapons, not buying from other countries. In response to the failed states arguments, we have some really good evidence that we can extend from the 1AC. So for example, neither Mazzaro nor Durso are about Latin America failed states. Some people would want to talk about that. But also, we have a piece of Stevens evidence from the 7th of November that says that, hey, Mexico is really on the verge of collapse. So sure, there might have been hype in the past, but Mexico is not that situation, which means we need to act now. So at the end of the day, what should we remember? First is that we're making separate claims on the negative about where different types of guns come from. Handguns and semi-automatic rifles are smuggled across the border, which means that the plan can't solve general gun violence. Where do the cartels get rocket-propelled grenades, hand grenades, tanks? They get them from other Latin American countries. The other thing that you should remember, if you're affirmative, is that you have some really well-qualified evidence and really good warrants in the 1AC to make sure you're using the evidence that you've already read. And sometimes you might not need to read 2AC evidence. And then finally, remember that the failed state cards are not specific to Mexico, which means that you should use a really qualified specific evidence to extend that scenario. So at the end of the day, hopefully you all have a good time debating the new Mexico advantages. We have some pretty good evidence here, and hopefully y'all can read through it, understand it, and feel free to get in contact with us if there are any questions.